Good evening. We're going to get started in just a few minutes here. I'm going to wait a few seconds just to allow other people to finish logging in and to set up our GoToMeeting presentation. If you have any questions at this time about how to use the platform or the material that we'll be reviewing tonight, please don't hesitate to use the questions or chat box below on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, welcome to the Online Campus Writing Center's Building Blocks for Better Writing Part 2. If you haven't seen the first part of this presentation, not to worry, we have recordings of it and it's not required in order to understand the present presentation. My name is Gabrielle Lynch. I'm the writing specialist for the Online Campus Learning Center. Today we'll be going through basically how to tackle any assignment or your thesis and dissertations from the beginning instruction stage all the way through to revising and polishing your resources. If you have any questions at any point, there's not many of us tonight, so go ahead and ask me to pause or to review a slide again. I'll be happy to do so. All right. The very first thing you want to do when establishing your writing is to decide what writing type you're being asked to do. After that, you can decide on your topic, your argument style, and the significance of what you're writing. These three things are required in order to craft your thesis statement. If we haven't established these three, it's going to be pretty difficult to write a thesis that we can stick through all the way through the process. There are three types of writing we're generally asked to do in college, from anything from the bachelor's level all the way through to doctoral. Exposition writing is writing that explains or describes a topic. So this is largely an investigation of an issue in detail. It doesn't interpret an issue, it merely explains it factually. Think encyclopedia type writing. It can evaluate the significance of an idea or issue and to whom it's significant. In analytical writing, we're being asked to explain how the elements that we described in expository writing relate to each other. Think of this as more the car manual kind of writing. We're explaining how things work together to create a whole. It will break down the issue into its parts, analyze how the pieces work together, and then evaluate the significance of how the parts work. So this is different than evaluating the whole. So instead of evaluating my car per se, I'm evaluating how its pieces work in order to perform a function. If I wanted to evaluate the actual car, I would move into argumentation. In argumentation, this is writing that provides a set of ideas with reasons to persuade the reader as to what you think. So now I can evaluate and interpret my information. This is more opinionated. Opinionated writing means that we need many more sources to justify our claims with evidence. The claim also has to be specific, which means you have to be able to prove it with the evidence you're able to provide. So that means that a 10-page paper is going to need more of a small claim compared to an 100-page dissertation, where we have more space to complete our argument. Once you have these pieces, you can go into thesis creation. You'll be able to use these action words that tell you what kind of writing you need to do to think about what kind of thesis you need for your paper. So you can see in exposition writing, there are words like demonstrate, explain, illustrate, rephrase, summarize, describe, which are very different from the analytical words, such as assume, categorize, contrast, distinguish. And argumentation is different yet. We have agree, conclude, determine, interpret, justify, prove. we can start to use these kinds of words to perform the actions we need in our paper. These words are the actions that we'll need to complete in order to fulfill the instructions of our assignment. So putting those into a thesis statement, we have a template that we can use for a bare bones argument. This isn't designed to be that final sentence of your first paragraph. This is designed to make sure that we have all three components of a correct argument. So when we get our feedback from our instructor, we're not missing anything in the need of revision. Often when you get comments like, synthesis was missing here, or I don't understand the significance of this topic, that's coming from not having one of these three pieces embedded in your argument. If you start your paper by creating a thesis statement like this, you can avoid those kinds of comments in your writing. So the topic we have, by looking at my topic, it can be seen that an exposition, argument, or analysis word from the prior page, which is significant because then I need to answer, so what? Why does this matter? Essentially, you never want to write something if it doesn't matter. Anytime you write something, even for a class assignment, it's going to need to be something that has value to the reader. What that looks like here is answering these questions based on your writing style. So if you use this template, you can use these different questions in order to ascertain what you need to put in the pieces, right? So for question 1, my topic, if I'm doing expository writing, I can ask myself, what are the characteristics of my topic? If I'm doing analytical writing, I can ask myself, what are the components of the topic? And if I'm arguing, I can say, what is the problem I want to handle? Why is it a problem? After that, I can form my exposition, my analysis, or my argument by answering these questions. If I'm doing expository writing, I want to take those characteristics that I assessed and then ask myself, from what point of view can this be examined? Art is a great example of this. When we analyze art, we explain its significance to someone. When we expose art, we just describe it from a certain point of view. For example, the point of view of an artist is different than the point of view of the viewer who views it at the museum. For analysis, I'll take the components I analyzed and describe how they work together. And for argumentation, I'll start to present solutions to the problem. This is why that specific argumentation style requires sources. If I'm saying something can solve a problem, or I'm trying to prove the solution to a problem, I'm going to have to provide evidence in order to convince the reader. That's why we specifically highlight the need for evidence and argumentation. Finally, for significance, the last part of the thesis statement, for exposition, I can ask myself who needs or uses it, why? So this is as argumentative as expository writing gets. Very simple, just an examination of why the thing that we're exposing is needed by someone. For analysis, we're going to explain what purpose do the pieces serve altogether? Why? Are they effective? And for argumentation, I need to end by explaining why the problem matters and to whom. These are the important pieces that allow us to form a strong argument throughout our paper. Once you have this, you can go to the next step, mind mapping. So mind mapping is a little bit more in depth than just regular outlining. The reason for mind mapping is to avoid those kinds of comments in your paper of things like, this isn't logical, or this is too emotional, or I'm not sure you proved your point here with this source. You can avoid all three of those kinds of comments by making sure you map ahead of time your main ideas and themes, which we call logos, your purpose as a writer, why are you writing this piece, or your ethos, and your audience, or the pathos that you'll include. Who you're writing it for should largely determine what kind of style you use. For example, if you're writing it for a professor, we want to avoid things like contractions or informal language. This could lead to offending our professor, which could lead to a reduction in points. So looking at this here, logos appeals to your reader's reasoning or logic. This means we're using facts to persuade the reader. Your ethos appeals to the reader through your credibility. which is achieved by citing your sources and making reliable claims that are not overstated. And your pathos comes from appealing to the reader's emotions, their needs, their values, or their fears. The rhetorical situation refers to a balance between these things. We can't have so much pathos, so much focus on emotion, that we lose sight of logos, or the logic and reasoning needed to prove an argument. Likewise, we cannot prove an argument without credibility as a writer. So we have to make sure that all three of these pieces are balanced in our writing. To do this, you can answer these questions before you start writing. If you mind map the purpose of your writing before you start, you'll be able to solve many revision errors that take a lot of time after you, for example, get feedback from an instructor or even the writing center. If you've ever gotten a paper back and you've seen that you needed a lot of revision to improve it, this is a step you can use in the future to avoid all of that revision. You can answer questions for yourself like, what is your purpose in writing this? What do you want to achieve by writing this paper? What does your audience care about? How can you establish credibility with that audience? Given your rhetorical situation, what possible counter-arguments are there? By thinking about your counter-arguments in advance, you can see where you'll have to focus your paper in order to prove what you want to share with your readers. The last question is, will you use an inductive or deductive outline for your reasoning? These are really the only two outlines that we use in graduate writing. In order to do that kind of reasoning, we need to follow specific steps that we'll review on the next slide. Inductive and deductive reasoning are two different ways of structuring your paper, your thesis, or your dissertation. If you choose to use inductive reasoning, you're beginning with a general case or idea. Think of this as more descriptive to start. For example, I might describe a case study of a patient that I'm working with. I'll continue with examples and a description of that case study. Then, based on the information I provided, I'll draw a conclusion based on that data. At the end, I'll connect my conclusion to a theory. I'll make a specific claim concerning how I analyzed the information. So you can see here how inductive reasoning sort of goes better with expository and analytical writing than argumentative writing. If you're writing argumentatively, deductive reasoning is largely the way to go. It begins with a specific claim, or that argument we were identifying in the thesis statement. From there, it will continue with subclaims, about one claim per paragraph, and it will provide evidence in each one of those individual claims to support them. At the end, we'll take a focus on the significance of the main claim to something specific. For example, the significance of good government in the present pandemic that we're dealing with. That would be a specific case that we could discuss government value in perspective. This has been a lot of information so far. Do we have any questions before we keep going? Okay, well, if we do, just let me know and I'll stop and we'll review the information. Okay. Once you've decided if you're using inductive or deductive reasoning, you can follow this outline. This is paragraph per paragraph for the most part, or chapter per chapter. So here we're looking at the first paragraph of an inductive paper being general background on the main idea or case, compared to the specific claim that must be presented in the first paragraph of the argumentative paper. Following, we'll provide paragraphs of different facts and evidence in inductive, and we'll provide specific claims that support our overall argument in an argumentative outline. If you outline like this prior to starting, you'll have a much easier time seeing if you've proved all of your information. Moving forward, once you have a thesis and a mind map and an outline, you're ready to start your actual main ideas. Now we're going to form those paragraphs based on the outline. All paragraphs should follow the same outline. We call them a meal plan. That stands for main idea, evidence, analysis, and a link to the next idea. Be able to think of this as kind of like the episode trailer for a paragraph. We're not trying to encompass all of the show in one paragraph, but we are trying to encompass all of an episode in one paragraph. Good paragraphs act like funnels, which means that they don't just present a square block of information, they immediately connect to the next paragraph, which provides a lot of argumentation support. So for example, let's look at this and decide if all parts are present. The current literature suggests that clinicians lack competency and consideration of the relationship between culture, race, and the experiences of LGBTQ youth. More specifically, current literature lacks emphasis on the discriminatory experiences, mental health needs, and lack of resources of immigrant Caribbean youth of color. The United States of America has a Caribbean immigrant population of 4 million, which makes the experiences of this community very relevant to our society. For this reason, it is proposed that more research should be conducted geared specifically towards the experiences of this population, to be done with the purpose of creating a basis of understanding on how to effectively treat this population within a clinical setting. So you don't have to unmute or anything, but in the questions box or in the chat box, what do you think? Do we have all 4 parts of this meal plan? Any takers? Okay, I'll give you this one for free. No, we don't. We're missing one part. We're missing the link. I don't know where this is going. This paragraph is great in terms of the information it provides on the topic, but I don't know how it connects. I'm missing the information of how the writer is going to take this and transform it throughout the paper. Here I can add one, which will be studied in depth below. So you see how that's pretty simple. It's not a whole sentence even, it's just a clause. But by adding that, I'm explaining exactly how I'm going to proceed throughout this paper. If you meal plan like that for all of your paragraphs, you'll have an easy time performing analysis. Because we formed a strong thesis to start with, we can let our thesis shape the analysis of our evidence. That means that we are going to use that thesis to explain how each part of the paragraph serves the purpose of our writing, supports the main idea, and that'll lead us to choosing language that convinces our audience. So for example, in each paragraph, you want to explain how you want the audience to understand the evidence. Don't leave room for them to misinterpret. This largely happens when we present source information, but we don't explain why it's significant. So for example, if you use a lot of direct quotes, but you don't explain why those quotes matter, we're leaving too much up to the reader to interpret. We can avoid that by being sure that we're explaining why every piece of evidence is significant. You also need to explain how that evidence supports the main idea. So because the paragraphs are not papers on their own, you need to explain how the idea serves the greater thesis statement that you created. Essentially, you can do this by making a mini thesis statement at the end of each paragraph. You can even use the same template that we used to start. By doing that, you ensure that you're creating synthesis between your little arguments in your paragraphs and the bigger argument in the paper. You also must consider the audience and the language that you choose. You have to explain the evidence in a manner that appeals to the reader's emotion. For this reason, APA largely advises that you avoid inflammatory language. This means if the person who disagrees with you read your paper, would they be able to be persuaded by what you wrote? If the answer is no, we want to go back to the drawing board and pick different language. Your paper should be accessible to the person who doesn't agree with you. Now, ideally in academia, that's what we try to do. We try to create very sound, non-emotional papers that we can use to convince others to take a look at our side of the argument. So how can we do that? We can use these kinds of analysis. We can question and answer in each paragraph. We can problem, solution, solve, so present a problem to start and then solve it throughout the paragraph. We can provide a hypothesis and then prove it with evidence. We can compare and contrast situations. We can use cause and effect to explain why something has happened. Or we can describe change over time, so we can reveal something that needs attention paid to it. To do that, you can answer these questions. So we looked at questions before at how to solve our greater argument. These are questions for solving the puzzle of a paragraph. To start with, whenever you start a paragraph, you need a topic sentence. This topic sentence prepares the reader to understand the material you're going to present. You need to answer what? A specific arguable statement that is then supported by evidence of a source and answering how. So this is what we were talking about, not leaving your reader in the dark. After you provide a claim in your topic sentence, you need to not just provide a source, but a following sentence that explains how does this prove the topic sentence that I provided. Then you need something at the end called a warrant, which is an explanation of the logical connection between the claim and the evidence. So for example, I can't just say, this quote proves my argument. I have to answer the question why. I have to explain how, either logically, credibility-wise, or emotion-wise, provides support for my argument. Let's take a look at this. Is this source properly analyzed? Students feel nervous about using sources in academic writing, though they need to. As Franz showed, students feel uncomfortable paraphrasing and citing sources. Looking at these steps, do you think that the source was properly analyzed? These are sort of obvious questions, aren't they? Because we're always going to say, no, probably not, and then explain why, right? So no, this is not properly analyzed. The warrant is missing. Why? Why is this true? Students feel nervous about using sources in their academic writing, though they need to. As Franz showed, students feel uncomfortable paraphrasing and citing sources, which may be the key factors in student writing anxiety. Now I've proved why my source shows that my topic sentence is true. Now, when you have a lot of this going on, a lot of paragraph analysis, it can be hard to keep track of it all and to put it all together to create a cohesive paper. If you've ever gotten comments on, this seems to be a bit disconnected, or you don't have transitions in your paper, this is the slide for you. Transitions explain the relationship between the ideas in the paper. Basically, they're mathematical equation signs that put everything together in perspective for the reader. They act like addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division in the writing, helping the reader to follow through and interpret your meaning. We have a couple of little templates you can use to put transitions in. So if you have a paper to revise, or you're looking through and you're like, I don't know if I used a transition, this can help you. The first one, you can connect ideas at the sentence level. So if you're struggling to connect your topic sentence with your evidence and your significance, use this template. Start with the first idea. I used transitions in my paper. Then decide what's the connection. Are you adding the same thing? Are you contradicting? Are you multiplying what you mean with more evidence? Idea 2, I received a higher grade. Let's connect those with a transition. I've decided I have a cause and effect transition. So I'm going to use therefore, which indicates the two things are related. I used transitions in my paper, therefore I received a higher grade. Now, if you want to do this at the paragraph level, such as putting a transition sentence at the start of a following paragraph, you can do it like this. If the first paragraph's idea was I did not know how to use transitions last week, and the second paragraph's idea is I now know how to use transitions, I can use that same kind of adverbial conjunction to start my sentence in the second paragraph. So at the end of the last paragraph, I'll submit the idea to the reader. Unfortunately, I did not know at that time how useful transitions were. Then when I start the next paragraph, I can say, however, this week's workshop changed my view on transitions. Just the usage of that word connects my two paragraphs. It explains how they're related. Any questions at this point? Okay, great. We'll keep going. So essentially, if you need to know when to use transitions, you use them whenever you change your tone, your topic, your thoughts, or when you're adding additions to a previously stated topic. So those types of connections are utilizing topic sentences, adding variety to your transitions, and introducing your topic in a way that's beneficial to the reader, or relating one paragraph to the other, like we looked at, creating flow throughout the paper. So looking here, which transition sentence is which? Which one connects sentences and which one connects paragraphs? Our first one, the critical race theory, has been connected to counseling LGBTQ youth. Our second, however, in order to fully understand the adversities experienced by the Caribbean youth of color that identify as a part of the LGBTQ community, we must first examine what the letters within the LGBTQ acronym mean in regard to this community. Which one can start a paragraph and which one can connect a paragraph? The first one is not using a transition at the front. Here we have a whole list of our transitions. So that first sentence is just introducing information. It's not connecting to any previous information. But the however that we used in the second sentence example is a connection to a previous idea. However indicates that that's not the first sentence I used. Something else is necessary to understand the whole meaning. In this graph, you can see examples of all the different actions you might want to perform when you're adding your ideas together. If you're looking for transitions, you can come to this chart and you can decide what you're looking to do, such as compare information, prove, give a cause and effect example, show an exception, show a sequence, and then choose a transition from that exact category. This will help you in order to categorize what you want to do with your paragraphs, and also to ensure that that's what your reader receives when they read your paper. These are also available on our website in PNG forms that you can download and keep, so don't worry too much about jotting all of this part down. After you've performed those functions, the next thing you need to consider is synthesis. You know, lots of us have experienced that comment in our papers, right? There's no synthesis here. So let's explore what synthesis means. So far, we've looked at how to make a thesis statement in order to guide the totality of our paper. We've looked at how to outline based on our thesis statement. We've looked at how to outline paragraphs and the 4 pieces that is required of every paragraph. Then we looked at how to connect paragraphs using analysis and transitions. So now we're going to take a look inside the paragraph and see how exactly do I make synthesis happen. The first thing you need to know is how to use sources. In every paragraph of graduate level writing, you need to integrate multiple citations. Essentially, there's no synthesis if there's not at least 2 citations per paragraph. This is because what synthesis largely means is showing the consensus of the field. You're synthesizing for your reader how the field feels about the topic. This is important because anyone can find a single citation that agrees with them. But finding more than one, finding 2, 3, or 5, that can be more difficult. That's also where we start to identify gaps in the field. If I can't find 5 different citations that agree with me, that topic requires more research in order to be fully fleshed out. It's an excellent way when you're doing your literature review of finding the gaps that you can use in your thesis and dissertation. It also helps us to avoid over-reliance on a single source. This is not a way to prove an argument. If you're alternating between APA in-text citations and bringing the authors in line, you can also avoid feeling like you're repeating that same citation at the end of every sentence. And the last thing we need to be careful of is while we're aiming to introduce more than 2 sources per paragraph, we are not aiming to introduce more than 2 quotes per paragraph. We don't want to be adding so many direct quotes that the ratio of someone else's words to our words is thrown off. So for example, you want to use the author year format once. This is where we put the author's name as the subject, right? Marshall et al. Found that. Then we want to vary the structure afterwards. I do not want to continue to say Marshall et al. Every time I start a sentence. I also don't want to avoid citing. So I want to be sure that I'm referring to the study in each of the sentences until I change my study. So this is a cool trick with APA. You don't have to repeat the same parenthetical citation in every single sentence. As long as you continue to refer to the same study and you haven't changed citations, you can use expressions like this. The study further showed, the authors revealed, these findings are important. So here your author knows you're referring to the same study. This sort of inference is allowed in APA and it helps you avoid citing the same way multiple times. However, if I went like this, Marshall has found that, Marshall also discovered a relationship between, Marshall's study further revealed that, just reading that out loud, we can tell that that's not a pleasant experience for the reader. So we want to avoid overly relying on the same format. To fix this, frame your usage of sources within your own analysis. So avoid direct quotes entirely where you can, and don't quote data and results. There's no need to do this because we can paraphrase it. Your general rule of thumb should be, if I could paraphrase this without losing the power of this information, I should do it. If you can't rephrase it in a better way and it's a very powerful statement, that's an excellent usage of a direct quote. But we don't want to end up faultily quoting, which looks something like the example on the right, where I have 3 different strands of quotes from different sources put together in the same statement. I don't really know what the author thinks by looking at this kind of thing. I only know what those sources think. This is not connected enough. I can fix it by starting with one of those topic sentences that we talked about. Studies of undergraduates reveal conflicting conclusions. Okay, now my reader knows what I want to achieve. Now I can integrate my evidence. While France states that many students do not know of the writing sources that are available to them, Goldstein claims that utilizing these resources is a necessary component of academic writing success. Here, I put those 2 authors in conversation with each other. I used a transition to explain the difference, while indicates that these 2 are at odds with each other. And now my reader understands that I'm trying to explain there's some conflict here. So here we can see a prime example of how the transitions can create the argument. A few notes on APA citation conventions. If your first citation is an inline citation, your subsequent inline citations don't need the year. This means if you start by saying per APA 2018, you can continue to say APA after that without the year. However, anytime you use parenthetical citations, you do need a year. So you'll never be able to have a parenthetical citation that just has the author's name, for example. And if the first citation is a full parenthetical year, the first inline citation requires a year. So for example, if I started with that APA 2018 in parentheses, I have to say APA in 2018 in parentheses in the next one. The very first inline reference to the author, where you pull the author's name into the sentence, is always going to have a parenthetical year following it. Paired parenthetical citations can also border paraphrases and quotes. So you're kind of sandwiching the information, indicating for the reader what belongs to another author. So I can cite APA in the year before the paraphrase, and I can put the page number at the end of the sentence. This is really helpful for the reader. So here are 2 examples then based on our understanding of synthesis. As you can see, the first example is not synthesis. These paragraphs only have 1 citation per paragraph. I haven't put these sources into conversation with each other. My reader doesn't know what I want them to understand about these sources. However, in the second paragraph, I provided a topic sentence. Studies of undergraduate students reveal conflicting conclusions regarding relationships between advanced scholarly study and citation efficacy. Now my reader knows how these different sources are going to support something that I want to prove. Here you can see too, there are several usages of transitions as well. I have although France found, Goldstein determined something different. So there I'm putting those two in relationship to each other using that transition. Any questions? Okay, great, we'll keep going. Now that we've looked at what synthesis is, that we don't want to direct quote too much, let's look at how we paraphrase. Paraphrasing is a higher order writing skill. It's one that's required in research writing. That's because we need to put sources in our own words in order to focus on our own argument. Here are some process tips for it. Start by rereading. Don't read a passage once and try to paraphrase it. Read it at least twice so that you're sure you understand it. Then, as soon as you start to write the paraphrase, put that passage out of sight. If it's out of sight, you're not going to use the original structure and words of the passage. This will help you avoid plagiarism concerns. When you're paraphrasing, try to start fresh. Open a blank document. Don't look at your other writing or other sources, and talk to someone about the passage. Explain it to someone who's completely unfamiliar with the idea. This can really help us ascertain what we think about the source. This also helps us use our words. Writing the idea in your own words, focusing on how it connects to your argument, is how you achieve a successful paraphrase. If I keep the structure or the words of the original source, I have not paraphrased correctly. The OCWC has a couple of templates you can use for paraphrasing. So if you decide that the 4 tips didn't make you feel quite confident about how to paraphrase, go ahead and pick one of these templates up from our website. Then anytime you want to paraphrase a source, you can follow these exact steps in order to ensure that you're using paraphrase conventions and avoiding plagiarism. For example, I can answer these questions. I can start with an inline citation by answering who said it. How did they say it? Now I can choose a talking verb that explains the author's purpose. This is how I can get beyond just the sentence I want to paraphrase by sort of explaining the overall purpose of the writer that I'm looking at. Then I can explain what they said. Summarize in your own words more than a few lines. Trying to paraphrase a single sentence is incredibly difficult. Try to paraphrase 3 or more sentences where possible. That way you have something to work with and you're not trying to just change the structure of a single sentence. Before you close that paraphrase sentence, explain why the information is interesting. Really be sure you include a phrase that explains the implications of what the author stated. Who does this information matter to? Why? In our second template, we're just reversing it a bit. Instead of starting with an inline citation, we're finishing with one. So I'm going to start with what they said, the same thing, why is it interesting? But then I'm going to take a bigger focus on how it connects to my argument. Explain how it specifically supports your thesis statement. How does it prove your point? Then you can put a parenthetical citation at the end. Here's some examples. Here I've taken an entire paragraph and I've paraphrased it in a single sentence. This is a high success strategy. By doing this, I am no longer afraid that I have just changed the words to synonyms of a single sentence. Okay, moving forward. An important thing to note while you're reading is to pull quotes before you start writing. So if you pull quotes as you write, sometimes they're not as connected to your original reading of the source. The first time you read a source is really the time you form opinions about it. So for example, if you're reading and you're like, wow, this was really powerful, write down on the side of the page, why did you care so much? What made it valuable to you? Then when you go to paraphrase, you have answers to those questions of why something is significant. Do your best to paraphrase the content you pull. This is important. We already discussed how we want to avoid direct quotes because we want to be sure our own voice is more present. I see I have a question, just 1 second. Passive sentences. 1 second, Evan, I'm trying to pull up your whole question. There we go. This has been an everyday battle for you? Okay. Yes, we can talk about passive sentences, absolutely. When you say passive sentences have been a battle for you, are you saying that you need to know how to make them more active, or that you need to know when it's okay to use passive voice? Both, okay. Yeah, I'm actually going to pull up a different PowerPoint real quick for that one. We're almost all the way through here, so let me finish these few slides on how to revise, and then I'll pull up the other PowerPoint real fast and show you a couple slides on that since we're doing really well on time. Does that work for you? Okay, great. So I'll finish up here. This is actually tied in to active versus passive voice. Using signal phrases is a great way of being sure that we are using active voice. So here we have a little template for doing that. If you're trying to connect ideas to other ideas, you can use things like embedded phrases, which my teacher also has emphasized. So I think signal phrases are useful for an audience, which my teacher has also emphasized, and then provide a direct quote. Here I put my subject first, right? I can reverse that too if I want to focus on the teacher and make the teacher the subject by answering the question, who said it? My teacher, a linguistics expert, insists, and then add the quote after. So when you're trying to figure out how to make something more active, start by immediately asking yourself who did it or what did it. That will start helping you to pull the actor of what you're trying to talk about to the front of the sentence. All active sentences start with an actor. They start with a person who is actually doing the verb. This is different from the passive sentence, in which the first noun that you use is not the actor of the verb. So if you want to make an active sentence, you can use templates more like this, where you're answering exactly who said it or who thinks it. Usually it's you or it's an author that you're quoting. So moving forward from signal phrases. In your resources for proper sourcing and structural synthesis, make sure you group articles that are related by theme. This seems somewhat obvious, but really think about it in that outline you do to start your paper. Add 2 citations to your outline before you write a paragraph that relate to the subject for that paragraph. That can help you be sure you're performing synthesis. Paraphrase whenever possible, like we mentioned. Abide by APA. So follow APA rules anytime that you're quoting an author or citing an author. This is a good time to note that APA 7 has been released. We haven't fully transitioned to it as a school, but expect it in the fall. So right now you can use 6 or more authors, abbreviated to et al. In the fall, you can use any source over 3 authors immediately with et al. That's very useful and easy. It makes it much simpler to write out your citations if you only have to put the first author's name and then abbreviate all the rest of them to et al. This rule is not changing. You're always going to cite the page number for a direct quote, always. And if you're going into your literature review, for example, we highly recommend that you use an annotated bibliography to organize your sources. It's a little bit harder to organize a thesis and dissertation in terms of the synthesis we're discussing. If you do annotated bibliography work, it will be simpler for you to do this. So for example, if you perform annotated bibliography, you're summarizing and evaluating sources related to the same topic. So to do that, we recommend you write a little annotation for every source you read. This is not double work. You can then use this annotation to make your literature review. So after you read a source, if you write a sentence or a paragraph that's a summary of the main idea, and then you write a paragraph that evaluates whether it's a good idea, whether it's significant, and how it supports your idea, you are doing work ahead of time for your thesis and dissertation. So it won't be extra. You won't be wondering when you go to write your literature review, what was that source about? I can't remember if it was useful or not. Doing this ahead of time is very helpful. When you do annotations, think about it as kind of like a sandwich. You want to have your original thought about it, followed by a paraphrased thought from the paper, and then another original thought afterwards. This makes sure the ratio is very good and balanced. Ideally, you want your paper to be 2/3 your ideas and only 1/3 other people's ideas. So we're getting to the end of paper writing. Now you're looking at it and you don't know if you did what you were being asked to do. This happens to all of us. To fix that, use a reverse outline. Use these questions for each of the sections of your thesis, your paper, or your dissertation. As you go through, ask yourself, what was the main idea of this paper or this section? What claims did I make? Then ask yourself, did I give evidence for that? Look through it and tell yourself, yes or no, I gave evidence for the claim that I intended to make in the section. Then make sure you check for analysis. Did you explain how the evidence proves that claim that you intended to make? And finally, did you explain how that topic relates to the overall argument or the following paragraph? If you answer these questions as you read your own paper, you can find any possible errors before you submit. You can also do this at the paragraph level. Look at each paragraph and make a mini thesis statement for the paragraph using the information that you wrote. If you do that, you'll be able to ensure that you have the main idea, the evidence, the analysis, and the link. If you can't make a thesis statement based on your paragraph or you find it's kind of hard, that's a really good tip that we're missing something. You can also ensure that you have a topic sentence this way. Ask yourself, is the topic of the paragraph clear from only the first sentence? If the answer is no, revise. Then ask yourself at the end, can the reader tell the topic of the following paragraph from my last sentence? Or does the first sentence of the following paragraph explain the relationship between the two? Is a transition present? If you revise asking yourself these questions about the start and finish of each paragraph, you'll be sure to catch those questions about synthesis and transitions. And conclusion writing, a couple of do's and don'ts. You do want to begin with a summative statement, but don't use cliche language like in conclusion or in summary. We have an APA heading for that, right? So there's no need to use that language in the paragraph. You can use a ratio of 1 sentence of summary per main point or subheading in your paper. This means try to collapse an entire idea into a single sentence. You're essentially paraphrasing your own work. So in the same rules that we looked at with our paraphrasing earlier, don't paraphrase a single sentence. Paraphrase an entire paragraph. Don't repeat your thesis though, or your introduction in the same words without changes. It may have been a while since the introduction, but the reader will still kind of get the gist that you've repeated the same information. You also want to conclude with one of the following based on your overall purpose. You're either concluding with the significance of the main idea, the implications for the relationships between the ideas, why does it matter of how they work together, or a proposed solution to an issue. This is really important as well that you don't introduce new information. If it's a conclusion, it needs to conclude. That means it can't add new information. This is very important in order to be sure that your reader feels like you're finished. If you don't avoid adding new information, then your reader is going to be left with questions. And questions usually indicate poor feedback from our instructor. So summarize in conclusion the rhetorical situation you set up, which means make sure you answer what is essential for your reader to know about your topic. This was our main points from our logos. What was your strongest evidence? Only provide that in the conclusion. What research theme does your writing connect to? And what actions need to be taken? What are the consequences for the stakeholders of the issues you've identified? Be very careful about ending with very emotional language, though. Emotion is powerful, but it is not evidence for our claims. So we want to end very cautiously whenever we are using emotion. This is a lot of information, but writing a paper is a lot of work. So looking at these steps, while it may seem like this is a lot of work in order to write the paper, this is actually a lot less work than going back through and having to revise something multiple times because one of these pieces were missing. So while it seems like you're doing extra things in order to start your paper, you're actually removing extra work at the end in revision. And to be honest, one of those is a lot more frustrating, especially as we're getting up to a deadline and we need to submit something by midnight. You don't want to have to be revising because you realize something was missing at 11:50 before submission. Doing this ahead of time can certainly help avoid that. So at this time, I'm going to open up another PowerPoint really quick. So I'm going to shut the screen off for just 1 second, but don't worry, not going anywhere. Okay, Evans, I'm loading it now. Typically, we cover passive and active voice when we're talking more about style than talking about the pieces of academic writing. So passive versus active is actually something more related to APA style than anything else. Okay, so let's review active versus passive voice. In active voice, we have to follow a very specific pattern. If you're ever unsure, how do I make this passive sentence that my teacher highlighted active, you just put them in this exact order. Start with your subject, the actor who completes the action, followed almost immediately, unless otherwise necessary for information, by the verb or the action that the actor has completed. After that, you can follow with more information about the direct object, the person or the thing affected by the action, and any descriptive phrases that you need to clarify your meaning. This is the order you'll follow to make any passive voices active. So for example, the client completed the research survey. Now in passive voice, we topicalize the direct object for emphasis. The reason understanding this is important is because passive voice is not actually wrong. Passive voice can be very useful when we really need to emphasize who's affected by an action. So we pull them to the front. We say this object was affected by this action, the action completed, and then we say by and the subject who completed the action. So for example, the research survey was completed by the client. This is a full and correct passive voice sentence. The problem that we come across is very often we leave off the by the subject phrase. So we get a sentence like, the research survey was completed. Now, while that is a correct sentence, it can create a problem with understanding the agency. So for example, who did it? Who's the agent who completed the direct object? We don't know if we don't have that transposed prepositional phrase of by the subject at the end. So if you're looking to create a correct passive sentence, you must have a phrase at the end of the direct object and verb unit that says by the subject, the actor who completed the action. Then you have a correct passive voice sentence. Now here are the problems. Passive voice is not a natural pattern in any language. So when you're moving pieces around in a sentence, your reader has expectations, and that movement can confuse the reader in very long or important sentences, especially when we get into things where we have a sentence that's 3 lines long, for example. If my subject is way down at the end of 3 lines and the direct object starts those 3 lines, that's a lot of information for someone to process in order to create that relationship between the two. So we have to mitigate that confusion as to who is performing that verb. We also have to avoid compromised clarity. So like I mentioned, if it's 3 lines long, we have some transposition distance as a problem. The study's questionnaire was initially completed at the outset of the research by the client. This isn't even as long as most sentences that we put into our dissertations, right? But already it's a little difficult to track who completed what and how. So the order of the sentence, because it's not natural English order, can make it pretty difficult for the reader to understand a complicated idea. Now, it is okay if you need to highlight an important element, like the trials were conducted simultaneously. It's important to emphasize trials. You need to be sure that your reader is paying attention to that information when you discuss your methodology, for example. It doesn't sound the same if I say the researcher conducted the trials simultaneously. Now it sounds a little different, and it isn't exactly what I intended to communicate. So passive voice would be okay here. It's also okay if active voice would fail to communicate my meaning clearly. The president was shot. Sorry, I didn't mean to switch. So the president was shot is a very powerful sentence. If I move the president over to the end of the sentence and I put a subject in the beginning of the sentence, now I've placed less importance on who was affected by this very powerful action. So if I really want to emphasize something and I want to make sure my reader pays attention to it, transposing that direct object to the front of the sentence is sometimes the only solution. So when we're looking at the question of should I use passive or should I use active, about 90% of the time it's going to be I should use active. It's the clearest way of communicating your meaning and making sure that all of the rest of the sentence parts that you need are included. Something that happens when we have too much passive writing is sometimes we don't see fragments, because when we're reading through our sentences, passive voice doesn't start with a subject. So it's easy to let a fragment slide because we are already saying to ourselves, well, that sentence is different because the subject doesn't start that sentence. Another thing to consider is if you're not using active language, then it's very hard to emphasize things like cause and effect, right? Or your argument, for example. Active voice is very argumentative, it's very clear, so it can really help prove your point and make your A plus B equals C the most clear to your reader. But as we mentioned, passive voice is okay if you couldn't change the sentence without losing the meaning. So when you're looking at that passive voice, Evans, ask yourself that. Ask yourself, does this lose its feeling and its meaning if I put it into active voice? If the answer is absolutely unequivocally yes, you have an argument for the use of passive voice there. But if you could change it into active voice and you didn't lose your meaning and it seems a little more clear, you should absolutely be using active voice in your statement. If you're finding that you can't find them, so for example, you're like, I don't think I use the passive voice that much, and you submit it and you get it back and you're like, oh man, there was 10 in there and I didn't see them. Go ahead and use Control All and search for by. By is often included, like we looked at, in our passive sentences. So go ahead and use that strategy to check for any instances that you can. You can also check the different auxiliary verbs. So I'm going to go back here. So you can see I have was completed here. Search for instances of was and were, because they are always going to precede a verb used in a passive description of a source, for example. You can also, search things like is or will. Those are also auxiliary verbs that come with passive voice. But those search strategies will help you catch instances of passive if you can't find them just by reading through your paper. Does that clarify it a little bit? Great. I'm happy to hear it. This recording is available. The presentation I'm looking at isn't part of this recording that's going to be emailed to you. But if you're looking for these slides again and you need them, you can access our webinar page and just pick our advanced APA recording. The advanced APA recording has all of this information in it. So if you need it again for any reason, feel free to go ahead and access that. There's also an active versus passive voice page in our writing resources. So if you're looking for active and passive voice, you can get a downloadable page to use too. Does anyone have any more questions? Very good. If you do, please feel free to contact us at our email. I'll zoom out actually and zoom into that for you. You can contact us at online writing center at thechicagoschool.edu. We recently launched a new website as well, and that can be very useful because it is not one of the SharePoint Drive sites. So it's very mobile for your phone and for searching for APA. So I'll go ahead and I'll add that website in for you in the chat right now. Go ahead and click on that, OWLC-TCS.com, and you'll have access to all of our newest resources, including a digital tool that allows you to select information on what you want to cite and gives you the correct format immediately. So it's very similar to other tools that are interactive that pre-format things for you, except you do have to write the citation yourself, but you're following the correct format. So that way you can be sure you're not losing any points. It's a really great tool to use as well for plagiarism. There's a page on the website that reviews all of the best strategies for citing and when it's needed and what constitute plagiarism and what doesn't. We're adding new resources every day as we launch this site. So if you have anything that you're looking for that we don't have at the moment, please do shoot us an email and we'll create a page based on those resources. If you have a chance to give us feedback on the website, we also welcome that. There's a feedback link at the bottom. Please go ahead and let us know what you think. It can be anonymous, so if you're not liking the site, that's okay. But if you do and there's something you thought was useful, we'd love to hear about it. Other than that, we hope to see your paper on our schedule and have a great night.